Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everybody. I'm just going to give one more minute to let people log on to the webinar. Joanna, I'm just seeing a little meeting reminder pop up if you want to close that.
There it is.
Okay, we can get started now. So hi everybody. On behalf of the Northwest Territories Council on Invasive Species, Pests and Pathogens, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for the fourth and final in our series of webinars to celebrate National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Today, we are thrilled to have two talks on invasive pathogens presented by Joanna Wilson and Naima Jutha. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Joanna Wilson is the Wildlife Biologist for Species at Risk at the Government of the Northwest Territories. Her presentation will give an overview of white nose syndrome, a fungal disease that has hit bat populations elsewhere in North America. We'll look at what it might mean if white nose syndrome spreads to the NWT and how we can help our northern bats. So with that, I'll hand things over to you, Joanna.
Thank you. And thanks a lot for having me to present today. So yeah, I am going to be talking about the invasive pathogen that affects bats, which is, as Joanna said, a fungus. And it causes a disease called white nose syndrome in bats. So I'm just going to start with a little bit about bats in the Northwest Territories. I live in Yellowknife, and where I live, we don't see very many bats. It's only very occasionally. But bats are a fairly common sight for people who live south of Great Slave Lake and in the Decho region. In fact, bats are found across the boreal forest in the southern part of the Northwest Territories. And there is still some uncertainty about how far north their range extends. So why should we care about bats? Well, they do play an important role in the ecosystem here. And among other things, they're also helpful to humans. All of the bats in the Northwest Territories eat insects, and that includes things like mosquitoes, other biting flies, insects that are pests of forests and gardens. And they eat quite a lot of them. So just one bat can actually eat more than 2,000 insects in a single night. So they do play an important role. White nose syndrome. This is a disease that affects hibernating bats. And the disease was named for a distinctive sort of white fuzzy growth that you can see in this picture that tends to appear on a bat's muzzle and wings. And this disease is caused by an invasive pathogen, which is the fungus Pseudogymnoascus destructans. That's a bit of a mouthful, so we usually call it PD for short. This fungus was introduced to North America in around 2006, and since then it has been spreading quickly. PD is a cold-loving fungus. That means that it grows well in cold, dark, and damp places, which unfortunately are the same types of places where bats hibernate. So bats like the ones, like the little brown bats in this picture, they spend the winter in places where the temperature is stable and cool and stays that way throughout the winter. So in the Northwest Territories, bats are hibernating in quite deep underground karst caves with those nice cool temperatures and fairly high humidity. We call these hibernation sites hibernacula. And when they're hibernating, the bats are relatively inactive. So they're metabolic rates are lowered, their resistance to disease is also lowered. Now, PD, which likes to grow in the cold, attacks the bare skin of bats while they're hibernating. Whoops. The PD fungus, it's not a threat to people, but it does cause quite a serious disease and often causes death in the bats. So what happens is it attacks and it grows on the bats while they're in that inactive state of hibernation. The fungus causes physical damage to the tissues in the skin, as well as physiological changes like dehydration and imbalance of electrolytes. And all the changes cause the bats to warm up and become active. So when they should be staying in their hibernation state, they're actually waking up and flying around and wasting energy that they need to make it through the winter. And so these symptoms and behaviors together are what we call white nose syndrome. The bats use up their energy, they burn up the fat that they need to survive, and where insect prey are not available, of course, in the winter, the bats end up starving to death or freezing. And it is quite common to see bats with white nose syndrome do sort of strange behavior, like flying outside in the daytime or flying around during the winter. So areas that have been hit by white nose syndrome pretty hard in Eastern North America, a lot of bat colonies have declined by over 90%, and many have disappeared entirely. So there have been quite extreme population declines from white nose syndrome. People often want to know how many bats have been killed by white nose, and we don't actually have a good estimate for that, but it's definitely in the millions. So back in 2011, a group of experts estimated over 6 million bats had died of white nose at that time. And that's 10 years ago now, so we know it's a lot. So I'm just going to show a few maps to illustrate the spread of white nose syndrome. These maps come from whitenosesyndrome.org. They actually have a cool animation of the spread that you can watch if you go to their website. So this is the first map in the series, and the red X here is showing where it was first discovered in North America in the winter of 06-07. What happened was a caver in a cave in New York photographed some hibernating bats that had an unusual white substance on their muzzles and also noticed some dead bats. And then the following year, biologists started documenting bat die-offs in the area. As people started to study it, they found out that PD, the fungus, it was unknown to science until it turned up here in North America. But when they started looking for it elsewhere, they found it also on bats in Europe and Asia, where it occurs, but the bats do not seem to get as sick from it as they do here. The most likely scenario for how this got here is that probably a person visited a site in Europe where the fungus was and then accidentally brought it to North America, maybe on their shoes or their gear. So this is, as I said, where it was first documented. And just fast forward to 2015, you can see white nose syndrome was spreading rapidly across Eastern US and Canada. It is spread through bat-to-bat contact. It can also live in areas without bats, and so bats can pick it up from the environment as well. And the spores can last a long time on surfaces such as clothes and shoes. So it's also possible for people to accidentally move the fungus from one place to another. And this is where it was in 2015, and I'm just going to jump on the next slide to 2016, and you'll see that it actually turned up over on the West Coast that year. So it made a jump across the continent. And we think that this is probably accidental human mediated spread. Now fast forwarding again to today, this is the most recent map, and you can see it's continued to spread across the continent. It's now found quite broadly across central and eastern Canada and US. It's also found on the West Coast in Washington and California. So white nose syndrome is not here in the Northwest Territories yet, but we do expect that it will arrive here. This is that same map, but I just zoomed in a little bit. So you can see it's present now in Manitoba and Montana and Washington State. Those are kind of the closest to the Northwest Territories. It hasn't quite turned up in our neighboring jurisdictions yet, but we are expecting it to soon turn up in Western Canada. And if it continues to spread like this, it will probably turn up in the Northwest Territories eventually. So what does this mean for us? Only bats that hibernate for the winter are susceptible to white nose syndrome. So not all bat species would be affected. This slide shows the 8 different species that we have here in the Northwest Territories. And I just highlighted in yellow here the 5 species that hibernate. There are 4 fairly small Myotis species, and then also the big brown bat. The other 3 bat species migrate south for the winter, so they might still encounter PD and they might be involved in spreading it, but they haven't been diagnosed with it, and we don't necessarily expect them to get sick. So all 5 of these hibernating species that we have here have been confirmed with white nose elsewhere. And the ones that tend to be affected the most are the smaller ones, so like the Myotis species. Larger species like a big brown bat tend not to be affected as badly, maybe because of their larger body size, different physiology and behavior. They still get white nose, but their survival rates tend to be greater. So what we've seen in the east is very severe population declines in the small bats like the little brown Myotis and northern Myotis. But big brown bat populations have shown much more variable population trends. And our 2 most common bats, the little brown and the northern Myotis, are both highly vulnerable to white nose syndrome. They have experienced 90 to 100% mortality in many affected sites elsewhere. And because of white nose, these 2 species are species at risk. They're listed as endangered in Canada and special concern here in the NWT. This map here is showing where we have known bat hibernacula in the Northwest Territories. So the 2 red squares on this map are showing bat hibernation areas. We know that they're hibernating in the underground limestone caves in the Nahanni area and the Wood Buffalo National Park area. And these hibernacula actually have been designated as critical habitat under the National Species at Risk Act. And there are probably other places here where bats are hibernating that just haven't been documented yet. So there is reason to be concerned about the arrival of white nose syndrome here and its future impact on our bats. One question we often ask is, will the impacts of white nose syndrome here be different from what we've seen elsewhere? And that's an open question. I think the answer is maybe. There is some evidence that differences in bat physiology and hibernaculum conditions might favor bat survival more in the north. For example, a model of white nose syndrome survivorship found that in general, fat bats, bats that are fat in the fall before they go into hibernation, that use relatively cool and dry hibernacula are more likely to survive white nose. Our hibernacula here are pretty cool. They've been measured at about 2 degrees Celsius and less. PD can grow at temperatures as cold as 0, but its optimal growth range is a little bit warmer, between 5 and 16 degrees. So you can imagine that the growth of PD in a cooler hibernaculum in the north it will probably be slower. Our bats, from research done by Corey Lawson and her collaborators, looking at northern little brown myotis bats, they found they tend to be pretty fat in the fall. So they have quite a bit of fat to last through the winter. And that combined with the cool hibernacula means that they might be able to make it through the winter and emerge before white nose syndrome causes them to exhaust their energy reserves. So it is possible we might see some lower mortality rates here, but it's too soon to really say for sure. And those kinds of predictions are also relying on things staying constant, like constant hibernation temperature. You know, if those things change with climate change, then those predictions might not hold true. So our populations of the little brown and northern myotis are quite important. I mentioned these two species especially because they've been hit hard, really hard elsewhere, but they still have healthy populations here. And if it does play out that the survival from white nose turns out to be better in northern habitats, then our hibernacula might potentially become refugia and be important for the overall future recovery of the species. So we can see that our bat populations are becoming important at the continental scale. So knowing that white nose is spreading across the continent, what can we do? Well, there's not much we can do at this point to prevent it being spread from bat to bat, or from bat to cave, or from cave to bat. But we can try to prevent it being introduced by humans. If entering a cave or an old mine where bats might be hibernating, we ask people to decontaminate all their gear and clothing and boots before entering. So there are protocols in place for this decontamination to kill any fungus spores. And in fact, we recommend that people just try to avoid entering caves that might be used by bats, if at all possible. We also require decontamination protocols to be followed when people are capturing and handling bats for research and monitoring. And we can do other things that aren't necessarily specifically about white nose, but that will help our bat populations to stay resilient and healthy, give them the best possible chance of survival. So we can conserve important habitats like hibernacula, which are really quite important sites, lots of bats concentrated there, and they're quite fragile and sensitive to disturbance. We can also work on conserving summer habitat. And in some species, like the little brown and northern myotis, many females and their young will gather together in the summer to roost together in what we call a maternity roost. These can be in large dead or decaying trees, and they can be also in buildings. And these maternity roosts are really important sites for conservation. And when bats do roost in buildings or find their way inside, they're vulnerable to human-caused injury or disturbance, which can often be unintentional if people use inappropriate methods to try and evict the bats. So we do have a guide for managing bats in buildings that describes how to safely deal with bats in buildings without harming them. We're also interested in monitoring our bat populations to so that we know if they're healthy and are able to detect declines if they occur. One way we're doing this is through acoustic monitoring, recording the ultrasound of bats, and we're initiating monitoring under the North American Bat Monitoring Program to try and get some information on population trend over time. using acoustics. We're also conducting annual monitoring at 4 little brown myotis maternity colonies, where the pink stars are there on the map. We count the bats to estimate colony size. We band them, and we collect other data, including health information. When we capture bats in the summer, we screen them for signs of wing tissue damage caused by white nose. Also, dead bats that are submitted to ENR are tested for white nose. We have done some winter surveys at hibernacula to count bats and to look for signs of white nose. We did those from 2011 to 2015, and in more recent years, we were not able to carry them out. And we encourage everybody to report their bat observations to ENR, especially something unusual like bats out in the winter or bats flying during the day. There is quite a large coordinated continental response to white nose. We have a national white nose syndrome response plan. And for bat conservation efforts, we also have a national recovery strategy and a Northwest Territories management plan for bats that help to guide our management actions. And there is quite an intensive research effort underway in North America to fight white nose syndrome. Lots of current trials on the go, testing different management options. People are testing ways of treating infected bats, options to boost their resistance to white nose, modifications to the hibernation environment to help slow the growth of PD or to help bats make it through the winter. Even things like supplemental feeding by attracting insects to the hibernaculum. There's all kinds of things that are being tested now. And what we're seeing in some of these areas out east, where it's now been about 15 years since white nose arrived, after severe declines in several formerly abundant bat species, some of those populations, their growth rates have started to stabilize. And there are some populations of little brown bats in certain areas that are now starting to increase a bit, although they are much smaller than they used to be. Some individual bats have been shown to survive multiple winters exposed to white nose. So there does seem to be some hope there in terms of survivors that are able to persist, possibly due to resistance, innate resistance, or behavioral differences, or maybe other factors. However, bats have a pretty slow population growth rate, only one or two young per year. So any sort of comeback to their former population levels will take a really long time. And this is my last slide. I just wanted to put some web links for more information on white nose. Go to whitenosesyndrome.org or to the CWHC website. And at the NWT Species at Risk website, you'll find the Territorial Bats Management Plan. Okay, thanks. Back to you, Joanna.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joanna, for that great presentation. I'm just going to switch the presenter to Naima now. Naima, you should be able to share your screen. And if folks have any questions for Joanna, if you can just save those until the end of the presentation or at the end of the webinar, we'll have a question and answer period at the end.
Hi, Joanna. I didn't get to request to share my screen.
Okay. Let's see. Try again.
Can you hear me though?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, great.
Okay. I made it so that you should be able to share your screen. You just have to go over onto your control panel and select share screen. It'd be under the same controls where you can either mute yourself or turn on your camera. Should be right under there.
Okay, just a sec. Yeah, oddly, it's not showing up for me. It was definitely working before.
Joanna, if you're still on the line, maybe you can help Naima.
I'm here. Yeah, I will see what I can do.
Okay, if you can run down the hall and see.
Sure.
Sorry, guys.
It's okay, we'll take a tiny intermission. If folks do have questions for Joanna, you are free to enter them into the question and answer box. That will be in your control panel. Maybe we can answer a few questions before Naima's presentation.
Yeah, it just it's been frozen on you. Oh, so it might be something like that. I don't know. You could try coming out and back in again.
Sorry, folks, for the technical difficulties. Joanna, are you still there? Okay, Joanna, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, we've got a question from the audience. It says, are there explanations as to why European bat species are not as negatively affected by white nose syndrome as North American bat species?
Well, the theory that I've heard is it looks like the fungus has been in Europe and Asia for a long time. And so it's possible that bats there have developed resistance over many years to the fungus. Another factor I'm just guessing at is that it might also have something to do with the hibernation ecology of the bats there, if they're experiencing different conditions during the winter. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions? Folks can enter into the chat. I'm going to check on Naima.
Hello. There are no other questions yet.
Okay, sorry again to folks on the line. Thank you very much for your patience. We are getting the technical difficulties sorted out.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. Is my presentation full screen right now? No. Do you want to check if it looks full screen?
No, it isn't full screen. I don't see it.
Okay, that's not ideal.
Can you turn on your camera and let me know whether her screen is showing or not? Should be on. Minimize this. So you open up the presentation again.
Okay, Shiraz, can you see my screen?
No, I don't see it.
Okay.
Okay,
Oh.
I see your screen now, but I see a Word document. Okay, it's full screen.
It's full screen? Okay, fantastic. Okay, let's see if we can sort this out. Okay, so you can see full screen now, Shiraz?
Yeah, it's good.
That's great. Okay, so we'll work through the presentation now. Sorry about that, everyone. So hi, my name is Naima. I am the ENR Wildlife Veterinarian. I'm going to be presenting on another disease that we are very happy to not have in the NWT at this time, and we're hoping to keep it that way. This disease is called chronic wasting disease, and it's a prion disease that occurs in cervid populations in other areas of Canada, throughout North America, and in Europe. So I'll just dive right in the interest of time. Please let me know if the slides aren't moving forward, anyone who's paying attention. So first I'll start by giving a little bit of background on chronic wasting disease. And so throughout the presentation, I'll be referring to it as CWD. And so some general background here, CWD only affects members of the deer family under natural conditions. So I'm speaking about mule deer, white-tailed deer, elk, moose, and even reindeer. In North America, we've only found CWD in free-ranging deer, elk, and moose. Recently, they've actually detected it in free-ranging reindeer in Norway and Finland and in Europe. Other species are not thought to be susceptible to CWD under natural conditions. So wild sheep, goats, bison, and muskox are not actually thought to be susceptible to CWD, and there's no evidence that chronic wasting disease can affect cattle or domestic sheep. All of our caribou species, or so I should say caribou subspecies in the NWT, are considered to be potentially susceptible to CWD, and we'll talk about this later on in this presentation. But it is important to recognize that a case has not been confirmed yet in any North American caribou. But like I mentioned, reindeer in Europe have been identified to have CWD, and research in reindeer, which are considered to be the same species as North American caribou, has shown experimental infection to be successful and development of disease in reindeer. CWD, unfortunately, is always fatal. to those that become infected. There is no treatment available. There is no vaccine available for CWD. It can be very difficult to manage or contain once a positive case is identified, and we'll discuss throughout this presentation why that is. And it can have long-term population effects and cause declines in populations, particularly in vulnerable populations of cervids, like, for example, caribou. Of course, a disease like this would also have social and cultural and economic impacts on our, just in terms of the abundance of animals that we have, in terms of the availability of those animals for subsistence hunting and harvest, and of course for the enjoyment of wildlife in our territory and beyond. So at this time, there is no evidence that humans can actually contract CWD, but it is recommended that humans not eat meat that has from an animal that's been infected with chronic wasting disease. And this kind of traces back to the fact that it is a prion disease. So chronic wasting disease is caused by a tiny infectious protein particle called a prion, and this makes it part of a group of diseases called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. This is also the group of diseases that, for example, mad cow disease or bovine spongiform encephalopathy falls under, as well as Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which is the human form of the prion disease that has in some research been linked back to the eating of the consumption of cows that had been infected with BSE or bovine spongiform encephalopathy. CWD is contagious. It can be transmitted from one animal to another. It is an infectious disease. It can accumulate in the environment if it's shed from an infected animal and can last for decades. It's very difficult to detect, it's resistant, and it lasts very long in the environment because it's just very difficult to break down. And because of this, we can get even more transmission of the disease process, where prions in the environment can actually potentially infect other animals through ingestion. So like it says here on the slide, it's shed through saliva, urine, feces, and carcasses. So any of these being left on the land can actually spread the disease if they're from an infected animal. What makes chronic wasting disease so difficult to manage and eradicate if it does become established in an area is the fact that most animals that actually test positive for chronic wasting disease, sorry, I actually just realized that these slides haven't been moving on this screen. I'll move to this one. Here we go. So most animals that test positive for chronic wasting disease actually appear healthy. We rarely actually see animals appear sick until quite late in the infection. So it does spread very easily, and it's easy to go unnoticed because you have asymptomatic carriers. And so it makes it difficult to detect because when you're observing animals and they look healthy, you don't really have a reason to suspect they might be infected with chronic wasting disease. In order to actually diagnose an animal with chronic wasting disease, we need to send off samples to a specialized laboratory to actually determine if they're infected. Symptoms can take 18 or more months to actually show up in an infected animal. So that's a long time that they can be spreading because the prions are shed throughout the course of the disease. And like I mentioned before, it is contagious through infectious fluids and materials like saliva, blood, and feces. When animals do become symptomatic, they exhibit symptoms like becoming very skinny. They may have poor hair coat, abnormal behavior. They may seem neurological and have poor coordination or difficulty walking. Often they'll be seen excessively salivating, teeth grinding. They could have difficulty swallowing, and some people have noted drooped ears. Overall, the animal just appears very sick. So with this in mind, it is very important to report any sick appearing wildlife that you do see. But again, the likelihood of an animal with that tests positive to have symptoms is actually low because it takes so long for these symptoms to appear. Okay, so what I have here is a map of chronic wasting disease occurrences that were documented in North America, and this is from the late 1990s. The yellow dots here are cases of chronic wasting disease detected in captive animals, and those gray shaded areas are areas where our management units where positive wild animals have been found. The first documented case you can see here was in the United States at a research facility in Colorado, found in a mule deer. And chronic wasting disease has since actually expanded its range. Move this along here. So this is a map from 2018, and you can see that the range has expanded quite a bit, and it's now actually found in 26 states, which we'll see in the next slide. In Canada, most cases of CWD are actually noted in Alberta and Saskatchewan. The first case, interestingly, was actually in a mule deer at the Toronto Zoo that had been transported there from another jurisdiction. The first case in Saskatchewan was actually a farmed elk in 1996. And the first case in Alberta was also in a farmed elk in 2002. And since then, it's actually been found, it was found in a wild deer in 2005. And we can now move on to the map that represents today. And you can see that the spread has continued. We can see still that the majority of cases remain in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But we're watching as the range of CWD infection expands northward, recognizing that NWT shares borders with both majorly infected provinces, and that our wildlife don't actually tend to recognize jurisdictional borders that are just drawn on a map. This does become a cause for concern for us up here in the Northwest Territories. As of now, CWD has not been detected in the NWT, which is very good. But like I mentioned, and like we saw in those maps, the risk may be increasing as we see that we share borders with Alberta and Saskatchewan, and we're watching the range of infection expand. Chronic wasting disease, of course, threatens wildlife conservation, subsistence hunting, the cultural use and economical use of wildlife. So it's very important that our priority be to actively prevent the introduction of this disease into NWT wildlife. As we're seeing in the jurisdictions of our neighbors to the south, the outcomes can be really devastating to our wildlife populations, and the management and eradication after infection actually starts can be extremely, extremely difficult. When we look at caribou in particular, we know that our caribou and NWT are a vulnerable species in general, and many of our subspecies populations are struggling. And so it is important that we keep CWD out of our caribou. It has not been detected in any caribou in North America to date, but there is lots of research to suggest that they would in fact be a susceptible species. Like I mentioned previously, reindeer have been demonstrated as a susceptible species, and wild reindeer infections have been documented across the pond in Europe. We can see from this map, this pink over here, this is actually representing the distribution of chronic wasting disease in Saskatchewan. And as it's creeping further north, we're seeing it actually overlap with the boreal caribou range, an ecotype of caribou that does occur within the Northwest Territories. So towards the protection of NWT wildlife and caribou specifically as a vulnerable species of concern, I just can't emphasize enough how important it is that we prevent the establishment of CWD in the north. So what are the risks that we face as the Northwest Territories of CWD being introduced? So sources might be infected live animals being transported across the border or moving naturally, infected carcasses and meat being brought by hunters across the border or for other reasons. Contaminated material can actually carry CWD. Remember that I mentioned that it can be shed in the urine. There are different baiting tools that people use that can contain real deer urine that could be infective. Scavengers can be a vehicle of transmission, bringing over infective material like coyotes, wolves, ravens. And we're also seeing range expansion of white-tailed deer further into the north. We do have white-tailed deer in the Northwest Territories, and we see those populations starting to creep northward, perhaps with changes in climate and habitat. And the challenges that we face that only really emphasize these potential sources of CWD and the risks to our wildlife is a general lack of awareness of the presence of this disease in Canada and the risk that we face in the NWT. The difficulties around detecting, like I spoke of before, a lot of positive cases tend to be asymptomatic. And also difficulty in accessing samples. The samples that we take come from the heads of these animals, and we need to have access to those, and that really requires help from you, from the general public, to be submitting those samples when you come across them in your hunts, or potentially if you notice any mortalities in the field or any potentially sick animals. We also have limited options for the disposal of risk material at this moment in the Northwest Territories, which is an additional challenge. So prevention measures that are in place to help keep us CWD free. For one, the GNWT, Government of the Northwest Territories, works very closely with other jurisdictions to continue monitoring and managing the risk of CWD to new areas and to species like caribou. There are federal and provincial programs in place that are there to manage infective captive cervids or captive deer species, as well as wild cervids in the CWD affected areas in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And we keep ourselves aware of that, and we help the monitoring continue in these jurisdictions because they are the source of that risk to us. There's ongoing CWD surveillance and testing going on. We have an active wildlife health program, and myself, the ENR Wildlife Veterinarian. This program's been in place since 1990, and it monitors the health of wildlife across the NWT. This, of course, includes chronic wasting disease monitoring, and we do that collaboratively with our NWT hunters and our co-management partners. Currently, in the risk regions in the south part of the territory, we have, for example, an active CWD surveillance program where $50 for the heads of harvested deer species, deer and moose and caribou, is exchanged with hunters so that we can get those heads in, have them sampled, and then sent off for testing at a specialized lab down south for chronic wasting disease for ongoing monitoring. We also have, as a prevention measure, some, here we go. Some changes that were recently implemented in the NWT Wildlife Act. So the Phase 2 regulations include, after extensive consultations, ENR was able to put in new regulations in place that prohibit the import of live cervids into the territory, ensuring that we're not entertaining any risk of disease introduction from the chronic wasting disease positive regions. As well as prohibiting the importation of parts from harvested deer that are being harvested more than 100 kilometers south of our border. We don't allow any meat coming from those areas if they're bone in to be brought in unless there's proof that they are from a chronic wasting disease negative animal. So for example, if a hunter was to harvest deer species from that region, then they would have to work with the provincial chronic wasting disease testing program to have a negative result as proof prior to bringing those materials into the territory. There's also a ban on the use of baiting for large wild game. And so this helps to avoid the use of deer lures that may be infective with CWD material. In terms of surveillance, the ongoing looking for CWD, this is a very important part of the monitoring and management of a disease like this. Our objectives when we're looking for a disease like chronic wasting disease is to confirm that we are negative for it as a territory, but also to have measures in place to detect it as early as possible, which is why we really push for this active surveillance program. Our targets, because there is presumably such a low, if not nil, prevalence of CWD, it makes it very hard to detect and to prove that we actually don't have it, which means that we need as many samples as possible or feasible. So that includes samples being submitted by hunters and roadkills, or just animals that are dead or ill that are noticed in the wild that we can, check for chronic wasting disease. The more samples that we have, the higher confidence we can have in our status as a negative region for chronic wasting disease. And then should we ever find a positive case, it can help us to focus our response effort, and then we would be more likely to actually eradicate the disease if it got here. But I really hope that we don't get to that point. So how can you help? First off, you can promote chronic wasting disease awareness. Be an advocate, spread the word, find information. We have information available on our wildlife disease website, as well as throughout the ENR website, on things like import restrictions and our Wildlife Act. So find those resources, share them, and really educate yourself. That's the biggest way that anyone can help towards conservation in general. Be knowledgeable about cervid import regulations. What can we do? What can't we do? In terms of those regulations, and why are they in place? If you have harvested animals from Alberta or Saskatchewan, we do recommend that you work with the provincial monitoring programs to have those animals and meat tested prior to bringing anything into the territory, and in general to support the ongoing monitoring down south. Report any sick, injured, dead wildlife to your local renewable resource officer or wildlife officer, or to myself, the ENR Wildlife Veterinarian, and I'll put my contact information up at the end of this presentation. And lastly, participate in our sampling program to continue monitoring for chronic wasting disease. Any white-tailed deer harvested anywhere in the NWT, we'd love to test them. Any moose, elk, caribou in the southern NWT, we'd absolutely love to test them. So please do get in touch with your local ENR office and we can have that arranged. As always, there are plenty of people to thank when it comes to leading a program like this. Thank you so much to the NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens for inviting me to speak today. I really appreciate it. I apologize for the technical difficulties. I don't know what happened there, but I really appreciate your time. Big thank you to all of our community partners and our harvesters that have been submitting samples at this point, and to all of you for actually coming and educating yourselves and listening to this presentation. Thanks to our ENR biologists, our wildlife technicians, and our wildlife officers that are always on the lookout for more samples and collecting those samples, sending them off for testing. I'd also like to thank some experts in the field like Kate Nelson, who leads the CWD program in British Columbia, who are also facing a similar situation to us, being chronic wasting disease free and wanting to keep it that way. And to my predecessors, Dr. Heather Fenton and Dr. Brett Elkin, for their continued work on this program and for many resources to get me up to speed on what we're doing out here. And to other organizations like the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative and the USGS, who also provide a lot of great guidance on CWD management and wildlife health surveillance in general. I've put my email below here, as well as the website for wildlife diseases. Please do have a visit and have a skim. There are some really great resources there, including the book on common wildlife diseases noticed in the NWT, which can do so much to help you recognize sick and injured wildlife and know who to call and what you can do for us to be able to I guess, do something about it and learn from those occurrences. That's all I have for you guys today. Feel free to ask any questions, I believe, in the chat box that Johanna should be looking at.
Yes, I am. So thank you so much, Naima, for that great presentation. It took us a while to get going, but it was amazing and worth the wait. Hope everyone else agrees. Yeah, folks can now enter their questions into the question and answer box, and we will read them up to both Naima and Joanna. I hope that you're still there, Joanna. I assume that you are. And we've got some coming in already. So the first one is for Joanna. If you want to come turn your camera on again. It says, are any monitoring efforts being planned to search for new hibernacula in the NWT?
We have done some of those efforts over the last 5 years or so. We had a program in the Satu a few years ago where we were looking for possible caves in a area where there had been a report of some bats seen in the spring. We don't have a program right now on the go to do that, but we're definitely very interested in finding and documenting more hibernation sites. And yeah, so that's one reason why we're always very keen to hear people's bat observations, and particularly the closer it is to winter. Those are really of interest to us. I think you're muted, Johanna.
Of course, one more technical blip, but one more question for you. It says, besides building a bat house, what else can a person do to help or attract bats to an area?
Right. So There's information available on how to have a bat-friendly yard, for example. In addition to possibly building an artificial roost or a bat house, you can do things like maintaining large trees, especially dead or decaying trees on your property that bats might want to be roosting in. Having keeping your cats indoors. Cats can actually kill quite a few bats. And being aware of what to do if you encounter a bat in your house, or if you have bats roosting in your house, how to deal with that. Those are all sort of what I might call bat-friendly practices. And there's a great website, Bat Conservation International, that has a lot of information available on how to be bat-friendly, and especially if you're interested in attracting bats.
Perfect. And one question for you, Naima, says, how many animals a year are tested for chronic wasting disease in the NWT?
That's a good question. So I'm actually not at my computer right now, so I couldn't give an exact answer because I had to switch machines for the presentation. My best answer would be not enough. At this point, we get samples in kind of sporadically. I'd probably estimate that if we're going based on year, maybe around 20, if maybe 20 to 30. And thus far, all of the testing that we've performed has come back with negative results, which is great, but it doesn't really offer enough confidence in the fact that we are truly staying negative. It is almost more relevant to look at how much testing is going on in the northern regions of the provinces just south of our border, because that's going to be important to evaluating what the risk is of having this invasive pathogen starting to enter into the NWT. But yeah, like maybe optimistic, or maybe you know, hopefully not coming across too negative, but I would say that we want more tested for CWD, and that's going to come with increased awareness, increased you know, capacity to continue testing for sure, but not enough would be my answer.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Well, we are just coming up to 1 o'clock now. Folks can enter any last questions that they have, but if not, I just want to say a big thank you again to Joanna and Naima for taking the time to present today. Thank you for everyone who joined today's webinar. Especially thank you for your patience while we sorted out some technical difficulties today. But yeah, it was great to have you join us for our final webinar of National Invasive Species Awareness Week. And if you'd like to stay up to date on more events like this in the future, you can find more information on our website. That's nwtcispp.ca, or you can find us on Facebook by searching for NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens. So thank you, everyone, and take care.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.